Ohtani secretly brings Japanese gift for exhausted Pirates. Nobody expected it. Not the Pirates coaching staff. Not the players who had spent the previous 3 days grinding through one of the most physically demanding stretches of their season. Not the clubhouse attendants who had seen every kind of pre-game ritual and post-game tradition that professional baseball has to offer over years of working in and around the sport. Not even the handful of Dodgers staff members who thought they knew every dimension of the man they worked alongside every single day. Nobody expected Shohei Ohtani to walk into PNC Park carrying something for the other team. And yet there he was. Quiet. Unhurried. Moving through the corridor that connects the visiting areas of the ballpark with the kind of calm that follows him everywhere he goes. Not announcing himself. Not drawing attention to what he was carrying or where he was going or what he intended to do when he got there. Just moving with the quiet purpose of a man who had decided to do something and was doing it without needing anyone to witness the decision being made. What happened next was something that PNC Park had never seen before. And may never see again. The Pirates were exhausted. That word gets used loosely in professional sports. Players are always tired. The season is always long. The schedule is always demanding in ways that people watching from the outside cannot fully appreciate. But what the Pittsburgh Pirates had been through in the weeks leading up to this series was something that even veteran observers of the game had taken notice of. 17 games in 18 days. Road trips that cross time zones without the courtesy of adequate recovery time between them. A stretch of the schedule that the baseball gods seem to have designed specifically to find the breaking point of a roster and apply pressure directly to it. Players were running on reserves they hadn't known they had. The training staff was working overtime. The manager was making decisions every night that were less about strategy and more about survival. About which players had enough left in them to give the team something useful and which ones needed to be protected before the protection became too late. The mood in the Pirates clubhouse before the first game of the series had the heavy quality of a room full of people who were still doing their jobs but doing them from a place of deep depletion. That was the team Ohtani walked toward. He had made the decision quietly. Those close to him said later that it was not a spontaneous gesture. It was not the kind of thing that occurred to him in the moment and was acted upon before anyone could talk him out of it or complicate it with the logistics of what it meant for one team star player to bring something to the opposing clubhouse before a game that both teams needed to win. He had thought about it. He had prepared for it. He had brought what he brought from Japan specifically because he knew this series was coming and he knew what the Pirates had been going through, and he decided, in the quiet way that he makes most of his decisions, that the right thing to do was the right thing to do regardless of what it might look like from the outside. What he brought was not one thing. It was several. Carefully selected. Wrapped with the kind of attention to presentation that Japanese gift-giving culture considers inseparable from the gift itself. Traditional items that carried meaning in their country of origin. Things that spoke of rest and recovery and the kind of care that one human being extends to another not because of obligation but because of genuine recognition of what that other person is going through. He handed them to a clubhouse attendant near the entrance to the Pirates' side of the facility. He said very little. Just that he hoped the team was doing okay and that he wanted them to have something. Then he turned and walked back toward the Dodgers' side of the building to prepare for the game. The attendant carried the items into the Pirates' clubhouse without announcement. That was how it entered the room. Not with a speech. Not with any context beyond the name of who had sent it and the brief message that had accompanied it. Just a collection of carefully wrapped items from Shohei Ohtani sitting on a table in the middle of a clubhouse full of exhausted baseball players who had not been expecting anything from anyone that morning except another brutal day of professional baseball. The room went quiet almost immediately. Not the quiet of confusion. Not the quiet of suspicion or the careful silence of professional athletes trying to figure out how to react to something unexpected from a player on the opposing team in the middle of a pennant race. It was a different kind of quiet. The kind that settles over a room when something happens that cuts through the noise and the exhaustion and the competitive armor that professional athletes spend their careers constructing around themselves. It was the quiet of people being genuinely surprised by genuine kindness. One of the veteran players picked up one of the items and looked at it for a long moment. He didn't say anything right away. He just held it. Turned it over in his hands. Read the small card that Ohtani had included with a brief explanation of what each item was and what it was traditionally used for in Japan. Then he looked up at the room. And the room erupted. Not in the way dugouts erupt after a walk-off home run. Not in the explosive, chest-thumping way that baseball celebrations announce themselves to everyone within earshot. This was different. This was laughter and disbelief and the kind of noise a group of people makes when they have been carrying something heavy for a long time and something unexpected has come along and temporarily lifted it. Players were passing the items around. Reading the cards. Asking each other questions about what things were and how they worked and whether anyone had ever tried them before. The mood in that room shifted in a way that the Pirates coaching staff had not managed to shift it in 3 weeks of trying. In 10 minutes. With items carried quietly through a corridor by the opposing team's best player. The manager of the Pirates stood near the doorway of his office and watched his team for a moment without interrupting what was happening. He had been around the sport long enough to know that what he was seeing was rare. Not the gesture itself, though that was rare enough. But the effect of it. The way it had moved through the room and reached the people in it in a place that the usual tools of team management cannot always reach. He shook his head slowly. Not in disbelief. In something closer to gratitude. Word reached the Dodgers' side of the building before the pre-game workouts had finished. Dave Roberts heard about it from a staff member who had spoken to someone on the Pirates' side. He listened to the account without interrupting. When it was finished he was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. Not the smile of a manager who had just heard something strategically interesting. The smile of a man who had known Shohei Ohtani long enough to not be surprised by this and who was still somehow moved by it anyway. He was asked about it later in his pre-game availability. He didn't deflect. He didn't offer the careful non-answer that managers sometimes reach for when a question touches on something that exists outside the usual boundaries of pre-game discussion. That's who he is. That's been who he is since the day he arrived here. And I think what people sometimes miss when they talk about Shohei is that the baseball is extraordinary but the person is something else entirely. What he did this morning didn't happen because someone suggested it or because there was anything to be gained from it. It happened because he saw people who were struggling and he wanted to do something about it. That's not a baseball story. That's a human story. He paused for a moment. And I think that's why it hit the way it did. Ohtani was asked about it after the game. Of course he was. The story had moved through the ballpark the way stories move when they carry genuine feeling inside them. By the time the final out had been recorded and both teams were making their way through the post-game routines, there was not a person with a press credential in the building who wasn't planning to ask him about it. He answered the way he always answers things that matter to him. Simply. Without performance. Without the kind of carefully constructed modesty that is itself a form of performance. He was asked why he did it. He thought about the question for a moment. As if the reason was clear to him, but he was trying to find the version of it that translated accurately. They have been working very hard. Anyone who watches the schedule can see that. I just wanted them to know that it was noticed. That is all. He was asked if he worried about how it might look. About bringing a gift to the other team before a game that both teams needed to win. He looked slightly confused by the question. As if the concern behind it was one that had genuinely not occurred to him. They are still people. The game is the game. But before the game and after the game, they are just people who are tired. I think that matters more than how it looks. The room was quiet after that. The Pirates lost the game. That fact sits alongside everything else that happened that day without canceling any of it out. Baseball is still baseball. The standings are still the standings. The result on the scoreboard is still the result on the scoreboard, and no amount of goodwill exchanged in the corridors of a ballpark before first pitch changes what happens between the lines once the game begins. But the Pirates walked off the field that night carrying something different than what they had carried onto it. Not a win. Not a reversal of the exhaustion that had been accumulating for weeks. Not a solution to the schedule or the injuries or the 100 other variables that had been grinding them down through the longest stretch of their season. Just the knowledge that someone had seen them. Not the team. Not the franchise. Not the record or the roster or the collection of professional athletes that the baseball world evaluated and discussed and argued about in the context of standings and statistics and playoff probabilities. The people. Shohei Ohtani had walked through a corridor in PNC Park and seen the people. And in a sport that can sometimes reduce its participants to the numbers they produce, that was something worth erupting over. Even in a visitor's dugout. Even after a loss. Even then.